Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure having you again here. The survivors that actually managed to stay the first half day. I told you it's going to be a sweatshop, and we practically fulfill our promises. What we plan to do right now is to have a panel. Actually, I think we gathered the best speakers we can get on the subject matter, which is a growing phenomenon, the phenomenon of the lone wolf. Even the term is not very well agreed worldwide today. Are those really lone wolves? Many experts, many security services would argue that the term is misleading because these guys, maybe individuals, maybe are conducting individuals attacks, but they're being inspired by a terrorist organization. They see themselves as part of this or the other terrorist organization, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth. This probably will be some of our discussion as well. The definition that we use for this phenomenon, the lone attacker phenomenon, or the lone wolf, if you wish, is that this is an individual attack which is being conducted without any operational tie to a terrorist organization. It means that the terrorist might see himself as part of the phenomenon, might see himself as part of this or the other terrorist organization. If you would capture a lone wolf and you will interview him before or after the attack, in most cases, if it's in Europe, we would say, yes, of course, I'm ISIS. We heard today that ISIS would definitely jump on the opportunity and will announce officially that this or the other attack was conducted by ISIS. Nonsense, or in Israeli term, bullshit. It doesn't work like that. They don't have any ties to a terrorist organization. They see themselves as part of their mission. And they might be inspired by the terrorist organization. So the working definition that we have for this phenomenon is an individual attack that has no operational ties to a terrorist organization. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is a growing phenomenon. This is the representing, I believe, not the new phase, but the current phase of the evolution of modern terrorism. And unfortunately, we see more and more countries which tend to suffer from this phenomenon of terrorism and need to find ways to contend with it. What we intend to do in this panel is actually to bring you, first and foremost, the immediate conclusions from the research that was conducted by ICT. You heard the title of the research from the minister today. ICT in the last 6 months, half a year, conducted in-depth research on the phenomenon of lone wolves in Israel, trying to understand the incentives, the rationale, but mainly the psychological profile of those terrorists. So what we did, we actually created probably the biggest database from open sources on this phenomenon. We collected this information, we analyzed it, but more important than that, we, as a joint venture with the Ministry of Internal Security and with cooperation of the Israeli prison system, we had an excellent team of psychologists and sociologists, researchers that work with ICT, led by Professor Ariel Merari, who's sitting here with us, and later on I will call him to the floor to say a few words and to stress the main findings of this phenomenon. So what we did, we interviewed 45 lone wolves that have been arrested after conducting a terrorist attack within this wave of terrorism between 2015 to 2017. The common denominator is that there is no operational ties to a terrorist organization among those individuals. Some people were skeptic. They said, you know, those guys would never cooperate with you. They would not be ready to be interviewed by you. We were very optimistic, but practically, I can tell you that we wanted to interview 46 jail terrorists that fits this description, this definition that we had. 45 willingly cooperated with us. And when I say cooperated, it means that they sat for days with our experts, the sociologists, the psychologists. They answered the questions, they were interviewed, but also they filled sociological, psychometric, psychological and psychiatric tests altogether. It's as if the terrorist was lying on the sofa of Freud or somebody. No, Freud was not part of the team, I have to say. We wanted to recruit him, but it was a little bit difficult. So we were quite surprised with the willingness of those terrorists to sit down and to share openly their views with us. In that way, and I believe in the room we have people that already had access to research on terrorists in general, or lone wolf in particular. Maybe some of you have even interviewed lone wolves, but as far as I know, nobody conducted that type of research with lone wolves, with psychological tests, with psychiatric tests, and so on and so forth. It's even more interesting than that, because Professor Merari, about 10 years ago, led another group that was constructed by ICT experts. And about 10 years ago, he conducted the same research in the jail with the failed suicide attackers. So from our point of view, it was not just interesting to learn about the phenomenon as is, but also to compare that to the findings from 10 years ago with the same psychological tests and see what's the difference. I don't want to be a spoiler, so I won't tell you what are the differences here. But what I would do right now, with your permission, is the following thing. I would invite Uri Ben Yaakov, who is a researcher and the coordinator of that research, to present the findings as they are from the open source information and from the 45 interviews that we held. Then I would call Professor Ariel Merari to share with us his thoughts and his understanding and conclusion from that research. And afterwards, I will call the members of the panel that represent different experience, different point of view from different parts of the world, to share with us their conclusion from our findings and from the phenomenon that they had to deal with in their home countries. So with no further ado, Uri Ben Yaakov, the floor is yours.
Okay. So, let me put it here to be easier. Our research had three main components: the database of lone wolf attackers between October 2015 and December 2017, sociological and psychological interviews and tests that were conducted with the lone wolves in prisons, and then interviews with practitioners and academic experts relevant to the lone wolf phenomenon. I will present now the key findings of the research, and later on Professor Merari will present the conclusions. So our database included only lone wolf attackers according to the definition that was presented by Professor Ganor. It does not include attacks like stone and Molotov cocktail throwing. The interesting finding that you can see here is that almost 40% of the attackers of the lone wolves operated together with others in groups of between 2 to 5, usually friends, family members. 85% of the attackers were male. Average age was about 22 years old. The main group was between 19 to 23. Almost 1/3 of them were 19 to 23. Doesn't work. Okay. Somehow it jumped. Here we can see that we didn't have much information from open source about the terrorist use of internet, but we had information about 95 of them used social networks. And the interesting information is that 37% of those 95 posted information which could have indicated their intention to carry out an attack. This is a big number. 64 of the attackers attacked security targets, 31% only civilian targets, and 5% mixed targets. Here in this slide, we can see a sharp decline in the number of attacks during the first 6 months of the wave. This was stabilized later on an average of 10 attacks per month. And we can see also a decline in the number of success attacks during the period. 2015, we had a success rate, or they had actually success rate of 53%. 2016, 40%. And 2017, only 22%. We suppose that this has to do with the operations of the Israeli security forces. Then we conducted the interviews with 45 lone wolves in prison. We started with a sociological interview, and then we continued with psychological components, which include interview and several tests that maybe Professor Merari will elaborate on it later on. Just to give you the general but very, very interesting findings, 67% of the interviewees suffered from one or more pathologics. 15% of them had history of psychiatric problems, 33% personality disorders, and more than 1/3 were suicidal. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Uri. I would now call upon Professor Ariel Merari to share with us his conclusion from those findings and other findings of the conference. A few words about Professor Ariel Merari. I believe that Ariel is one of the main pillars of the field, the academic field of counterterrorism. In the 70s, all over the world, you would find somewhere between 5 to 10 real experts, academic experts on counterterrorism. No doubt that the spearhead of this pyramid back then was Professor Merari. We also have with us some other pillars. One of them would appear later on, Brian Jenkins. We have Alex Schmidt with us, and so on and so forth. I'm proud to say that everything I've learned from Professor Merari, who was my professor at the MA level and actually paved the way for me to the academic world. So, Professor Merari, please.
Thank you very much, Boaz, for your very kind introduction and speaking about ancient pillars of terrorism scholars. I must admit, you see Brian Jenkins right here. When I started trying to learn something about terrorism, the first thing I did was to write to Brian at the RAND Corporation and ask him whether he could send to me kindly some of his publications on terrorism. Brian preceded me by quite a few years, and that's the real pillar there. Anyway, now to the study. Wait a minute. Where do I? Where is the? Tamophili. Okay, very good. Okay. Now, starting by what Uri just said about the main conclusions of the study of lone actors that we have just now conducted. You should understand that in most cases there is no one motive that drives a person to carry out an attack. It's a combination of motives that end up in forming the decision of a person to do that. Now, our findings suggest that the most common factor, most common motive for a person to carry out an attack was some sort of a psychopathological mental state. That wasn't the case in all lone attackers, but it was the case in more than 50%. This was the main factor that drove people to carry out an attack. Let me put it this way. When you try to identify the main motivation of a person who carries out an attack in which he or she is likely to lose his or her life, is likely to die, you can always ask, what is the main motive? Does the person want to die, first and foremost? Does he want to end his own life? Or does he first and foremost want to kill others? Dying or killing is probably a key question here. And if I can just put it in a nutshell, in our study we found that in the majority of the cases, the main purpose of the attacker was to die. Killing was a byproduct, so to speak. In some cases, it was a wanted byproduct. In other cases, it was a byproduct the perpetrator didn't care about, but it was mainly the dying that motivated him or her. Now, why, if a person wants to kill himself or herself, why choose this kind of way to die? I asked, we conducted, Uri and I spent much time with a leader a woman, a leader of female prisoners, and asked her opinion. We sat with her several hours, and we asked her that question. Why would a woman, those women that she knew were in prison with her, why would they, if they wanted to die, as she said, first and foremost, why would they not jump off the roof, on the roof, or find another way of killing themselves? Why go and try to stab an Israeli soldier to get, herself killed by police or the military? And she said, first, suicide, killing oneself by his or her own hands, is forbidden in Islam. That's very simple. Suicide is forbidden in Islam, like in Judaism and for Catholics, suicide is forbidden. A person who does it is doomed to eternal hell. But if you get killed by police carrying out an attack on the enemy, then you are a shaheed, and that's okay. Now, another reason was, of course, the public atmosphere, but I'll get to that in the end. Go on. Now, we asked the interviewees in various ways. We repeated this question about intention to die in several ways in the interviews because we wanted to be sure that what we get is the true answer. And actually, we found again and again that more than half of the interviewees said that a wish to die was the most important motive. But there were also others that were simply psychotic, in a psychotic state. These were a minority, about 15%, but there were some that were in a psychotic state at the time of attack. One guy, for example, who carried out a knife attack, severely wounding a civilian, a man, said that he had a genie in his head, and the genie forced him to do it. He said, I argued with the genie. I argued with the genie. I tried to convince the genie that I shouldn't do it, but the genie won. So he did it. Several people were actually in a psychotic state. And again, another motive or background, relevant background that pushed people to carry out attacks was personal, family, or social problems. This was particularly common among women. Actually, 75% of the women did carry out the attack because of willingness to die. It was, in some cases, an acute quarrel with a husband. In one case, for instance, a husband tried to force his wife to be a prostitute. And she refused, and he brought home his friends, tried to make her cater to their sex wishes, and she locked herself in a room, and early in the morning got out, took a knife from the kitchen, and went to attack a soldier in a roadblock. She wanted to die because of this situation at home. Just one example. We don't have time to bring others at this point. But there were also people, a minority, who carried out the attack mainly because they were motivated by ideological, that is, nationalist and or religious sentiments. Next. Now, if we look at the characteristics associated with willingness to die on the other hand, on one hand, and the willingness to kill for ideological reasons on the other hand, there are interesting differences between those two types. People who wanted to die first and foremost usually, almost always, used a knife attack. And people who were motivated by nationalist, religious sentiments usually carried out attacks by more lethal modes, shooting or driving a car trying to ram people. So method of and lethality of the attack were different in people motivated by these two groups of motives. A second difference was in the impulsiveness and the time span between decision to carry out the attack and the actual act. In the case of people who carried out the attack because they wanted to die, the mental types, so to speak, the time span was very short, sometimes minutes, sometimes days, less than a week in almost all cases. Very, very short time between decision and implementation. In the case of the ideologically motivated types, planning was much longer. And it took sometimes even months, more often weeks, but sometimes months. Now, if a person wants to die, and that's the main motivation, what is the actual trigger? Why now? Why not yesterday or 2 days ago or 2 days later or a week later? Now, usually we heard, the most common, I think, description of the people who carried out the attacks about the moment that they decided to do it was, I was sitting at home looking at television. I saw how Israeli forces abuse Palestinian women. Usually they see it on Palestinian channels or sometimes on Facebook. And then I got mad and I went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife and went out and carried out the attack. Instantaneous decision spurred by some sort of a trigger of exposure to something that they saw on television. Now that doesn't mean that what they saw on television was their real motive. That person, in most cases, not all, but most cases, was a guy who was hesitating, shall I or shall I not die, commit suicide, that is. He was waxing and waning in his wish to die. But that little something at the last moment, said, okay, now is the time. Here comes also into the picture incitement that they are exposed to over the media in many cases during that period. Now, we asked several questions to find out whether there were situations under which the attackers would refrain from carrying out the attack. We asked, for instance, would you do it had you known that your family really objected, or your friends, or religious authorities, and so on? What we found out was that there were two factors that stood out as kind of factors that could help in preventing, could change one's mind towards not carrying out the attack. One was the knowledge of going to, I'll go to hell if I carry it out. I'll go to hell. Now, not all of the participants in the study were very religious. There were interesting differences between very religious and less religious people, but I'm not going to talk about it now. But there were some that were not very religious, or almost not religious at all by their own definition. Still, all of them, no exception, believed in paradise. Now, a majority of the men and women whom we interviewed said that had they known that they would go to hell, they wouldn't have carried it out. Now, that opens, I think, some interesting field for further thoughts. Another factor that was apparently effective, interestingly, only for men, and I'm not going to say why now, was the possibility of demolition of their homes, the homes of their families. The majority of the men said that had they been sure that their family home would be destroyed, they wouldn't have carried out the attack. That's a clear deterrent. Now, I'm going to end, I think, by referring to the study we did, as Professor Ganor said, many years ago, 10, 15 years ago. It was a long study. Anyway, there were clear differences between the types we found, types of attackers we found in this recent study on lone actors, and the types of would-be suicide bombers that we studied 10 years ago. First of all, there were, by and large, different personality types. I'm not going to go into the psychological fine-tuning here, but take my word. The other, well, I'll say just one thing. Here, psychologically, most of the people were psychologically unstable in the recent study. In the would-be suicide bomber study, most of the suicide bombers were people who found it hard to say no to figures of authority. They were people susceptible, especially susceptible to pressure or to influence by groups or by figures of authority. Now, the second difference was pre-attack behavior. In the suicide bomber study, they did all kinds of, the attackers did all kinds of preparations before they left. Having their photos taken, buying last gifts to their family members and so on and so forth, praying. Here, in most cases, in the recent study of loan attackers, it was spontaneous, no preparations. Now, let me just say at this point, and finish here, the difference between the characteristics of the suicide bombers 10 years ago and the lone attackers now is the involvement of a group. The suicide bombers were sent by a group. The group would not recruit psychopathological cases. They would not recruit psychotics. And they would take care that they were well prepared and so on. This is the main difference. Is that it, Uri? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel. Before I'll call the panelists to refer to that, I want to throw my 2 cents on our findings. And I call it the Bath model. You will understand why in a moment. Professor Merari already mentioned that probably there is no one reason that can explain all those cases of lone wolves attacks. And in many cases, this is a combination of different motivations. And we actually gathered those motivations into 3 groups. The first group are the ideological motivation, and it could be divided in a typology to subgroups of nationalistic, religious, and political reasoning. The other is personal, and personal could be an outcome of distress coming from socio-economical status, which is very low, interpersonal reasoning, a fight with the girlfriend or with the parents or whatever, family considerations and so on and so forth, and psychological reasoning, which actually Professor Merari elaborated on that, mental disorder, death wish, and we add to that also considerations and reasoning that has to do with honor. People that believe that what they did is the honorable thing to do. By the way, of course, it's an outcome of an education in which you have been exposed to incitement and radicalization messages that this is the honorable thing to do. Now, what we would like to argue is, and this is the bath that I promised you, think about this container of water, bath for that purpose, that allocate those sources of water from all of those reasoning altogether. Now, of course, it changed from one person to another person. One person, there is only one source, main source, that fill the bath. In other cases, it will be 2 or 3 or all the sources altogether. What is very interesting to see that the bath has a wall. And at the end of the bath, when the water comes up and up and up and reach the end of the wall, there is a spillover. The spillover is the decision to conduct the attack. Now, I would like to argue that this wall is different from person to person. It's different from attacker to another attacker. And this is the reflection of his mental stability. How much can he contain those influences, the incitement messages, the ideological reasoning, the personal problems that he has, and so on and so forth. Some has very, very limited capability of containing that. Others have much better capability to contain that. Furthermore, I would like to argue that this execution threshold, the top of the wall of the bath, is also something which is dynamic. And the triggers could lower down immediately this wall. The triggers, as was mentioned by Professor Merari, could be the wish to imitate another terrorist. We know that this is an epidemic phenomenon. One attack actually creates an imitation impact. Extreme emotions that came out of something that occurred or that he watched the TV and so on and so forth. This is practically changing the threshold, lowering it down, and immediately there is a spillover of the water. Immediately the attack, spontaneous attack, sometimes a little bit planned attack, is the outcome of that. Again, the common denominator, they don't need a lot of planning. You know, when we analyze terrorism in general, we refer to that as the equation of terrorism as if it has two factors, motivation and operational capability. In order that a terrorist attack would occur, you need both. You need motivation to attack and the operational capability that allows you to materialize the motivation. Not in lone wolf attacks. In lone wolf attacks, there is no meaning for operational capability. It's only and all about motivations, because the capability is always there. It's in the kitchen or in the key cars. So the capability is there. You don't need to prepare anything for that. Once you have the motivation, once you have the spillover, then the attack occurs. We will conclude this presentation here, and now please let me invite first of all Dr. Daniel Heinke, the Chief Detective and Director of State Bureau of Investigation, Bremen State Police, Germany. Please join us on the floor. And Mr. Brian Jenkins, good friend of ours, senior advisor to the president of Front Corporation, the USA, and also, we are proud to say, a member of the Professional Advisory Board of ICT. Professor Merari is already with us, also a member of our institute, and Commissioner Lou van der Taelen, the project manager, community and policing and preventing of radicalization, and Superintendent in Central Counter-Terrorism Unit, Federal Police of Belgium. And I would start practically with you, Lou, and I would ask your reaction, and later on I would ask it from Mr. Heinke, and lastly from Brian. You can speak from your seat. You can just take the microphone. Listening to what we have said, knowing much better than we do about the challenges that you face in Belgium of lone wolf attackers, what is your immediate reaction, and practically what can you tell us about this phenomenon in Belgium as well?
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here. Maybe I have to go back in time a couple of years and give you a little bit of history, because the phenomena of departures to Syria and Iraq was not new. We were faced to departures in the past to Afghanistan, to Somalia, to join Al-Shabaab and so on. But we were not expecting that large amount of departures. And so we were surprised. And in Belgium, we were looking, especially in these vulnerable neighborhoods, in Antwerp, Vilvoorde, Verviers, Molenbeek, and other Brussels municipalities. What went wrong? Were we, as a society, failing? Was there a failure? What kind of radicalization were we confronted to? What made them depart so quickly? So we were quite shocked. And it's in these reservoirs that they were fishing, and they were very successful because, yeah, and it was a result of group dynamics, the sense of belonging to this group, charismatic leaders, the recruitment, the propaganda, the powerful propaganda of Daesh made them depart so quickly. So this was the first, let's say, phenomena of foreign terrorist fighters that we then categorized in 5 categories in Belgium. We were taking a lot of measures towards it. And then we were facing returnees the first time. Yeah, that was foreign fighters. They were put in jail. Some were released, as we discovered that they were, let's say, going, especially in the beginning, for other reasons, more humanitarian reasons. And then we were confronted to another phenomena: those who never left, those who never had the intention to leave, those who were failed because we were doing a good job, communities, local authorities, police, intelligence, to stop them, and also in Turkey, to stop them. And this is what we call the homegrown terrorist fighters. Yeah? And when we look at the, let's say, the attacks of the last years, yeah, I can sum up them. It started we had an example, for example, of a lone actor in a mosque in Anderlecht. It's Sunni who was committing an arson in a Shia mosque, yeah, the Reda mosque. We had another attack by a French guy coming to Belgium and to stab in Molenbeek police officers as a result of the policy opposed to the hijab, the wearing of the niqab, sorry. We were then faced to the first spillover of foreign fighters coming back from Syria with the intentions to commit attacks, clearly directed, and that was Medina Mouche from the Jewish Museum in Brussels. I also have to say something on indicators, because here we see that people make mistakes when, for example, they visit websites. How is the museum protecting itself? Where are the cameras, the surveillance cameras? It's something that we have to take with us. Then there's another attack. It's on the Thalys train, and we are faced to, let's say, this message of Daesh calling for, please guys, commit. If you're no longer coming to us, commit attacks in your neighborhoods, but you have to, let's say, this interpretation of neighborhood is very wide, it's European. And we see people like Nemouche coming from France through Germany in Belgium. We don't know the guy, we don't have him in our database. Ayoub Al-Kazani from the Thalys is the same guy. He's from Spain, we don't have any, let's say, data on him. And he comes to step on the train on the Thalys. Luckily, the US guys were able to prevent this attack. But it's a new phenomenon. This brings me to more international exchange and more international cooperation and exchange of data. We have Europol, we have Interpol and other platforms. Please share. Yeah? And then we were faced to people who stood up in our neighborhoods, who were somehow connected to guys who left, and they started also to radicalize. Yeah? It was quite easy to put them in our database as people in the process of radicalization. The plan radicalism in Belgium, let's say, was working for the fully 200%, also with local authorities, as we created a local integrated security council, social preventive actors, the mayor in the lead, police intel. We share everything through information officers in the police districts. It worked well, but only for those that we knew that were in our database and that we were able to monitor. So the FTF, HTF, and then suddenly, well, maybe I have to say something new, because within a couple of weeks there will be new legislation on what we call the potential dangerous extremists and also terror convicted people, because they come out of prison. Will these old networks, will we see revival? Are they, let's say, also recruiting in prison, and so on and so on? Maybe just 2 seconds, and then I'll stop. Sorry.
No, fine.
But then we were confronted to the phenomena of people from which we knew nothing. And we have a guy, a Somalian guy, working in a company. He's kicked out of a company for violence. Yeah, for what reason? Maybe harassment. I think so. And he is then in this weak moment very vulnerable. Yeah, and very desperate. Isolated. He leaves his apartment. He buys a tent in Decathlon. He goes to the cemetery. Near the cemetery, he puts his tent and he stays there till the end. And the day before, he goes on the internet. What can I do? And then again, Professor, I have to confirm. What? No, where is he?
Here. Very good.
This suicide by cop is then an option. Yeah, as it is haram in Islam. Yeah, he commits a suicide by cop by attacking a soldier in the city center of Brussels. We have then this central station. This is also a guy from Molenbeek, but not from the vulnerable neighborhood in Molenbeek, in the better economic situation. But he is suffering his drinking. His wife left him because of violence into the family, and he's isolated. Yeah, he lost all his money. He has a lot of financial problems, and then it goes down. And he's also in this situation of being very desperate. Yeah, looking on the internet, what can I do? He downloads a template to become a soldier of the caliphate. Yeah, so it's a communication in one way. Yeah. And then he starts on the internet to download also or watch movies, how to make the ATP. Yeah? And again, I refer to what the professor said, very impulsive. He's not waiting till the ATP is dry and stiff enough. to put it in his luggage, he commits an attack at 20 to 9 in the evening.
So I'll stop you here. First of all, because you reach twice you said that the professor is right, so you might ruin that later on. So I will stop you here, but I'll come back to you in a moment. Dr. Heinke, what is your point of view on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your fascinating research here. I think the most important thing that struck me here is that obviously our situation is entirely different. And I think talking about lone actor terrorism, I'm always told don't talk about lone wolves. It's bad, talk about lone actors. So please excuse me for staying with the lone actors. I think lone actor terrorism is very different depending on the country you're dealing with. What you told us here about your research in Israel is most fascinating, and in some aspects, especially with the mental health issues, corresponds with findings of colleagues, especially in the Netherlands. But it's totally different from the German situation, and again, I think both are different from like the US situation. The US, less with a jihadism motivated background, but more right-wing extremism or self-government, etc., etc. To give you a comparison, perhaps to all of you, Germany is by far the largest member state of the European Union with a population of 82 million people. We had, depending on the definition of lone actor in the aspect of loneliness, in the last couple of years, we had between 1 and 3 successful lone actor attacks. That's all. We had a handful of more that were thwarted, but that's nearly it. That doesn't mean that we don't take lone actor terrorism very seriously, but the few incidents we had are not comparable with your findings here. And I think that depends not only on the societal background, but also on the situation people and the individuals, the perpetrators, are facing. You said in many of your cases, suicide by cop, as we'd like to call it, or the suicidal idea to get killed in the act, is a main motivator. Well, you can count on that in Germany. Because in
they won't be killed.
In our cases, none of the
you don't shoot very well. That's the problem, right?
Well, actually, German police is adapting, but over a very long period of time, German police took pride in not training to shoot, but in having shoot, non-shoot training. That's developing at the moment, to be honest. But in all those 3 cases I was referring to, the attacker was overwhelmed without deadly force, though including shooting the person. But still, so suicide by cop is by no means something you have to be sure of. So I think, as fascinating as your results are, they are most probably not directly comparable to Western Europe, especially to Germany. But
let me suggest an alternative explanation to what you have said. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's interesting. Maybe because of the fact that you don't shoot to kill, they don't commit those attacks. That's why you have so few terrorist attacks altogether, because it doesn't pay. They want to die in the process. So if they won't be killed by a cop, they won't conduct it at all.
Actually, that could be an explanation for at least this very specific subfield. We do have attempts of suicide by cop outside terrorism. Perhaps that it's much more likely that you had killed here in Israel by Israeli police or Israeli military during or carrying out a terrorist attack. Perhaps that's, like you said, in the front of their thinking. In Germany, terrorism motivated attacks are not that common. So we do have attempts of suicide by cop, but more in the general criminal arena. And those cases are very comparable to yours. We just don't rate them as terrorism motivated.
I'll stop you here for the time being, because I'm anxious to listen to Brian Jenkins right now and see the American perspective on that findings. Thank you very much.
Is this on?
You are always on.
First of all, I want to congratulate both Uri and Ariel on this terrific study. It really is fascinating. I also want to thank my buddy Ariel for now introducing me as an ancient pillar, which I'll add to my CV. Look, there are some similarities and are some contrasts between the Israeli experience and what we have in the United States. One important difference is a difference not necessarily in the population of terrorists, but in how we as a society look at this. In the United States, you can think of the term radicalization meaning the internalization of radical belief systems. To go further with it, it is then to carry out violence on behalf of those radical ideas. In the United States, it is not a crime to hold radical ideas. So we speak of radicalization and recruitment, or in this case it would be radicalization and self-recruitment to terrorism. But that sets up a kind of a trap for us, because when we look at an act of terrorism, then we go backward and we expect to see a radicalization process. And that falls apart when you look at the more impulsive cases of the lone perpetrators, the lone actors that you have studied. That radicalization in the traditional sense is simply not there. It is a much more rapid a decision to go violent. Fortunately, our numbers in the United States are small. The radicalization, by the way, although about half of our perpetrators are foreign-born, their radicalization takes place in the United States as well, because the majority of them who have carried out attacks or who have been arrested for carrying out attacks came to the United States as children, and in fact the average length of time between arrival in country and carrying out an attack or being arrested for plotting an attack, and I'm talking exclusively about the jihadists, is about 14 years. So clearly the radicalization took place in the United States. I think Ariel made a very important point there when he talked about his comparison with the previous study, where a group would not recruit someone who was mentally unstable, who was unreliable. I think the recruiting process has fundamentally changed. That's especially true in the United States, where we are far distant from the struggles that are inspiring these attacks. This is remote recruiting, people who, rather than recruiting, it's exhortation, although on offer in that exhortation is membership in the group, applause by the group, becoming, in a sense, a member of the group ex post facto. I suppose you get your decoder ring in the mail eventually as part of this group. And so that makes it different, because the kind of people who would be culled in any sort of a vetting process are not culled here. These are self-selectors. And that may also explain, because we see this in the United States as well, why perhaps in some of the earlier cases, your suicide study, you were seeing people who were more suggestible, whereas in the later study you are seeing people who are more suffering greater number of mental difficulties. In terms of being lone actors in this, that's true. The majority of the plots and the majority of the attackers are single individuals. They're not connected with any underground, with any organization. There's no continuing campaign. These are one-off attacks. In these attacks, about 40% of the individuals either were killed or carried on where the expectation would be that they would be killed. So a Nidal Hassan firing on soldiers at Fort Hood until he is shot down himself would be an example of that. Or the individual who more recently drove his pickup truck into the bike lane, killing 8 cyclists in New York. He got out of the truck holding a pistol, which was not a real pistol, but he was shot. Now, he survived. So I'm saying about 40% of them were killed or were wounded, and certainly could expect it to be killed. Yes, he survived.
Just mentioning
And so,
When you have a plastic pistol.
now, the other thing, so we're seeing a different population here because of this change in the recruiting. Again, self-selectors, many of them, and I can't come up with a precise percentage here because we haven't replicated the kind of study that you did. So we're going with really testimony of relatives and friends and other evidence, but certainly a much higher presence of histories of aggression, problems with law enforcement, petty criminality, substance abuse, and in some cases, clear evidence of mental disorders. So that clearly matches, and in fact, one of the problems, it would be a greater number, except again, back to the framework in the United States, in that at trial, and they're brought up for civilian trial, psychotics are often judged as incompetent to stand trial, and therefore legally they are not terrorists. They're crazy as opposed to simply being crazy terrorists.
Okay, we need to start to wrap up, and I still want to have a very short round, starting with Professor Merari this time. And I would throw out a question that might lead this short round. What is the future of this phenomenon? Are you expecting this to grow or to stay as it is, or maybe to decline, and we'll see a new evolution of this phenomenon? So, Professor Merari, I know that you have some reaction to what has been said before, so please take it.
I'd like to ask a different question, if I may.
You're my professor, man. Go for it. Don't let me stop you.
You know that over the recent 20 years or so, I've been learning from you, not the other way around. Anyway, I think we are, with the exception of what Brian just said at the end, in which he did talk about the mental state of perpetrators. I think what we generally heard here was description of radicalization, as if we were talking about radicalization in Germany, radicalization in Belgium. My question is different. Actually, we started this study here in Israel with a question. One of the main questions was, well, we knew that there were so many Palestinians who hate Israel. I mean, that's no secret. There are public opinion polls. More than 50% of the Palestinians said bravo, according to public opinion polls, reliable public opinion polls, said bravo when they heard about terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians or soldiers. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. It would be comparable to, I would say, hundreds of thousands of radicalized people in the United States in terms of their political opinions or support of actions that are violent. But only a few hundred carried out actual attacks. What is the difference between those who hold radical views, support violence theoretically, and those that actually do something? So our approach here was, we asked both questions actually. Why did this wave of attacks started in Israel in October 2015? And why did it subside so fast? But then we asked also the question on which I talked now, the psychological question. What is the difference between those who acted and those that did not act, even though they held the same views?
Why this person and not his brother that was educated under the same circumstances and the
right.
same education and so on?
Yeah. So, Brian.
Let's leave it here, Ariel, because we are very short in time.
Okay.
Let's leave it as an open question and let our
All right.
colleagues answer that.
Sure.
Okay? Brian, this time we'll go the other way around.
Okay. Look, back to that question. One of the things that we are seeing in this later generation of lone actors is that it certainly, I agree with you, with the study that shows it's a combination of factors. But what is interesting is that the ideological component may play far less a role in the decision to go violent than other factors. And in fact, what we're seeing more and more of are individuals who are inspired, especially by ISIS, by the exhortations and by the images of atrocities. And so we have just one quick example. A young man who was arrested for plotting. How did he happen? He was a convert. How did he happen to become a jihadist plotter? And his response was, he saw ISIS videos of beheadings. He thought that was really cool. So he decided to convert to Islam because they get to behead people. And that led him off into plotting. Now, he did put on an ISIS t-shirt, in a sense, on the way to the attack, but that was merely giving his act a degree of legitimacy, of, in a sense, eliciting applause. This was really a violent person. Back to your question very, very quickly, what we are seeing is where this ideology, or the ideology and the images and the examples provided by others is becoming a conveyor for individual discontents.
Thank you, Brian. Dr. Heinke.
Yeah, in the interest of shortening the time, Brian did a fantastic job because he said already half of that what I wanted to add. I totally agree with you. That's what you coined the remote recruiting, and especially giving the idea of a belonging there. The real Al-Qaeda style ideology is not that important anymore. But the idea to belong to something bigger, and then to live or to die for something bigger. In former times it could be the outlaw motorcycle gang, now we have a jihadist group. Seems to be a very big motive. So unfortunately, to answer your question, yes, I think we have to face a rise in numbers, at least in my area of responsibility, because of the rising number of successful or unsuccessful idols they had before. There are a rising number of cases among Western European societies, and so that could be a role model or example for others to follow. So though I don't think that they play that much a role like here in Israel, I think we have to face rising numbers, and unfortunately law enforcement has to adapt in this area. Let me add one more idea on this. As you pointed out in the findings of your study, and Brian already said as well, most of these lone actors are not totally lonely. So they have some sort of social interaction. And sometimes they don't even meet someone in person for one single time. But we had one case in our state, a 17 and 18-year-old Russian national, who one of my detectives coined a, what do you call it, children's room, a nursery jihadist, because he lived at home, he had nothing to do, he just had online communication, but he desperately tried to contact others and say, I'd like to kill a police officer. Well, unfortunately, in this case, we were able to detect this, and well, he lives in Russia now.
Thank you, Dr. Heinke. Commissioner Lauder.
What, if you ask me, will it increase or not? I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you that due to this, let's say, it's less appealing to join organizations like Al-Qaeda and IS. Yeah? So we stop propaganda. It's also very good. I would focus more on all these vulnerable individuals who are not adhering to this ideology, but also committing, let's say, lethal acts. And it's to try to improve the identification of these vulnerable individuals in our societies. That's one thing. Suffering, I'm not only talking about Belgian citizens, migrants, refugees coming from very difficult war zones, suffering from PTSD. We have to do something more. We can do more. Secondly, I strongly believe in community policing, and it's not only policing. It's about the community being engaged, and what you mentioned before here, citizens who see, who detect, the first line of defense, brothers, siblings, family, yeah, friends, informing the police. But before this, you need to train them on awareness, because if we look at the attacks in Barcelona, yeah, they came from Ripoll in the north. These parents were confronted to youngsters saying goodbye to the parents and talking about jihad and shaheed, but they were not capturing the right message. Yeah? So we have to train parents and let's say and society in awareness training. And then I strongly also believe in what we are now developing with Europol and other countries like Spain, UK, Netherlands and Belgium. This big data analysis, also Germany is involved in it. Big data analysis, tactical analysis, cross-matching information with biometrics, automated number plate recognition and so on. And the last thing that I mentioned here was, of course, always what you mentioned this morning, yeah, this balance to keep, always in full respect of human rights, of course.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I think that if I need to sum up this interesting panel that we have is this phenomenon of individual attackers is not going to disappear, and probably it's here to stay. It's a challenge that all of us are facing all over the world, in Western countries, in third world countries, in Israel and other parts of the world. And there is a crucial need for international comparative approach. Try to learn from this kind of research and to compare that to the characteristics of those lone attackers in different countries, your countries and others. Thank you so much for coming, and we are now asking our Master of Ceremony, Jonathan Davis, to take the lead. Thank you very much.